Hey guys, Michael here. Welcome back to Gaming for Immersion. And last week I did a video on what were my picks for the best mods to make the most out of a Kugath campaign. And I mentioned I was going through all the different legendary lords and testing out different combinations, collections for each one of them. And so this week I've got Skarbrand, and he is just about as radically different from Kugath as you could possibly get. So I'm going to go a lot faster in this one. I feel like I've already covered a lot of the mods that are going to come up time and time again in this different list of collections that I'm going to be going through, so I don't plan to cover in detail all of the same ones over and over again. Instead, I'll just kind of mention them in passing and also point out when some of the ones that I do recommend usually are not being chosen and why not. And that's going to be relevant for Skarbrand because, of course, there are a couple of mods that I did recommend for Kugath that I'm not going to recommend for Skarbrand. So anyway, let's go ahead and talk for a second here about Skarbrand. The main thing I would say about him is there's a lot less that you have to do with respect to the vanilla pacing of the game for Skarbrand than I would recommend doing for so many of the others, including what I talked about for Kugath. So generally speaking, I feel like the vanilla game plays too quickly. It's almost an arcade game. I call it a semi-strategy game instead of a proper grand strategy game because it's pretty much all about aggression. It's all about, just constantly going on the attack and I don't want to say never defending at all, because obviously you always have to do some defending, but you're almost always going to get the best bang for your buck by focusing more on the offense and expanding as quickly as possible. And of course, that's not really proper grand strategy. That's not how wars generally work, realistically speaking. However, having said all that, the mods that we normally use to slow down the pacing of most other campaigns are not ones that I would recommend for Skarbrand, because if you're playing a Skarbrand campaign, you're probably not in the mood for a slow-paced campaign. You probably want to you enjoy that faster pacing. You want to be aggressive. You want to be basically fighting as many battles as possible, which pretty much means playing right into the vanilla playstyle. Now, having said that, so I'm not going to recommend things like the regular minus 50% army campaign movement mod, but what I will say is there's nothing wrong with using it if you did want to try a completely different play style with Skarbrand. It will certainly work. In fact, that particular mod does give a sort of an alteration to the mechanics of Khorne, where the bloodletting gives you a little bit more time between battles before it starts to decrease the level of your bloodletting. So instead of only having 2 turns before you start losing your bloodletting meter, I believe it bumps it up to 4. So it's certainly something that the mod author has taken into consideration, and so you could still very well use it. It absolutely would not break your campaign. It would still very much be a fun campaign. But I'm going to just go ahead and make the assumption that for most people, you're interested in a fast-paced campaign. So the rest of this moving forward is going to be all about how to sort of make best use of what Skarbrand is really good at, the hitting and running, the destruction, and then subsequently the drawn to destruction mechanic, and all of that, and not so much some of the things that I talked about with Kugath. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this. And like I said, I'm going to basically only mention those staples that I went into more detail with Kugath. I'm only going to go into a little bit of detail in this case when I'm going to explain why I'm not recommending them. So I'm going to break this list down into really 2 different categories. One of them are the ones that I recommend for every Skarbrand campaign. And just as an aside, I'm going to mention, I think I've said this before, personally, I feel like the Skulltaker and Arball campaigns are practically unplayable the way they are right now. If I figured out a way to make them more difficult, then I could see doing one of these lists for them, but this is specifically more geared towards Skarbrand, just because I don't really recommend playing those other two right now because, or unless, I mean, if you're a beginner and you want to learn like the basics of the Khorne mechanics, I guess they could be good for that. But in terms of providing a really meaningful campaign, I just feel like they're just way too easy. Again, I don't know what CA was thinking when they designed those campaigns and let them get the whole way through the development cycle, including the testing, and not having, recognized how problematic those campaigns are. But Skarbrand, I still think, is quite playable. He's strong if you have, if you like that play style. But I don't consider him nearly as overpowered as the other two are, and particularly their ability to just teleport all over the map. So I'm going to break this down into two categories, one of them being the mods that I recommend for every Khorne playthrough, and then there's going to be sort of two different options for that second section. One of them depending on whether or not you want to use the Trajan mods or not, basically, because Trajan is probably the elephant in the room in terms of the Khorne mods. There's an awful lot of value there that you could get with the collection of Trajan mods. However, that is going to then preclude you from being able to use some of the others, or at least use them without suffering some difficulties in terms of balancing and units being missing, and I'll get into all that in just a minute. So anyway, the ones that I want to point out are, I think, very valuable for every Khorne playthrough. The first one is just like with Kugath. I'm going to recommend Cho's Improved Faction and Legendary Lord Flavor. And here you can see on the screen the changes that this mod does for a Skarbrand playthrough compared to vanilla. He really adds two faction effects for Skarbrand. The first one is a global cooldown -1 turn for Skull Throne rituals, and the second one is replenishes 8% campaign movement range after raising a settlement. So it just kind of leans into what Skarbrand already does well and makes him do it a little bit better. Another one that I recommended for Kugath that I'm also going to recommend for Skarbrand, and probably, quite frankly, most Legendary Lords, is the Expanded Hero Skill Trees compilation. Here's an example of what it does for a Blood Reaper, and what it in fact does is add really, I haven't counted them up, but it's quite a few additional skills and expands the number of points that you can put into some of the existing skills in the skill tree to make sure that you've always got meaningful choices whenever you're leveling up. You don't ever get to that point where you're getting a skill level that doesn't feel good because there's, quite frankly, nothing good to put it into, if anything at all to put it into. And of course, another one that I'm definitely going to be recommending, not just for Skarbrand, but again for most Legendary Lords, is the Victory Conditions Overhaul, which gives you 3 different routes that you can choose to try to get the equivalent of what would be a short campaign victory. A lot of thought has been put into these. They are thematic. They give you a great deal of diversity between the different Legendary Lords in terms of really kind of thematically guiding your campaign towards a particular objective, and it adds a lot of replayability to every Legendary Lord. So you can even, play through and try to succeed at one of the routes, and if you really enjoy playing that Legendary Lord, go ahead and play him again a second time and try to win the game via a different route. So the ones for Skarbrand, the first one is basically all about spreading your corruption over at least 50 regions, and then also taking control, either by direct ownership or through vassals and military allies, of basically a lot of the really essential Legendary Lords all over the map. So this one is quite a significant ask in terms of a victory condition, because it really is going to take you all over the map. But if anybody can do it, it's Skarbrand, right? The second route is Blood for the Blood God. As it explains here, Skarbrand's mere presence is enough to induce gruesome displays of mad rage in friend and foe alike. The Exile's Blood Speakers hope to amplify this aura across great distances with the Blood Feint. This is a lot more targeted. These are provinces that are relatively close to where Skarbrand starts, so not quite as difficult to accomplish this one as it was with the first route. And then you have the third one, Skulls for the Skull Throne. This is destroying the Golden Legion. This is all about going up against the Tomb Kings. Here we have Cetra as your number one objective in terms of destroying a faction, but then there's any number of provinces here that you would have to own as well, which are down in sort of a southern southwestern direction from where Skarbrand starts out. If you want to know more detail about the victory conditions overhaul, I did just release a video that goes into a lot more detail on this particular mod just a few days ago, so I don't want to go into all that same level of detail in this video. Now, another one that I will recommend for Skarbrand, even though I did previously say I don't think you want to slow the pacing of the campaign down, I still recommend using the War of Attrition Reduced Replenishment mod, and that's because the vanilla numbers just aren't good enough. It's not realistic, no matter who you're playing, including a fast-paced lord like Skarbrand, for casualties to be as almost meaningless as they are in vanilla. So what this mod does is it does force you to basically still have to pay attention to the casualties that you're experiencing in battle, which means that you want to fight battles in a way to minimize your own casualties, and there can occasionally be times where you're going to have to slow down to recover a little bit. To me, it doesn't have as big of an impact on a Skarbrand campaign if you're not using some of the other mods that I'll talk about here in just a second. But I feel like you want to have at least some realism and a little bit additional challenge introduced into your campaign. So I can see this one being something that a lot of people would probably disagree with me with. But again, I just feel like the current rate of replenishment in the game is just absurd. There's no reason why you should be able to fight battles and lose half of your army and then be at full strength the next turn. And in my particular campaign here, I'll just show an example of how, yeah, this really made for a much more interesting campaign because I was always fighting battles. And as you can see, I've done just fine here. I even had stacked the Endgame Crisis to hit me as early as possible. And wouldn't you know it, it ended up spawning right next door to me, right down here with Sentinels of Nagash. So I actually had the Endgame Crisis right on my front door, so I had to fight against them as well as doing the usual Skarbrand expansion. And what that meant was basically I've had to juggle the fact that Skarbrand's army has been less than full strength pretty much for this entire campaign. But as you can see, it's still certainly possible to be successful in this campaign despite having the reduced replenishment. To me, it has just made it a much more interesting campaign. All right, and then the ones that I said that I'm not going to recommend that I did recommend before, I think I've already explained why I don't recommend reducing your campaign movement range for a Skarbrand campaign. I also want to touch on the one by Serb, the mod known as Slower Expansion and Settlement Supply Lines. And the reason I don't recommend that for Skarbrand is because he's really the exception to the rule in terms of how he expands anyway. Most of the time, you're not expanding by conquering new settlements. Most of the time, you're actually raising settlements, R-A-Z-I-N-G, and just letting them sit there as ruins until they get drawn to destruction, and then all of a sudden you find yourself with a new settlement. I just feel like that mechanic, being unique to Khorne, it doesn't really fit very well with what that mod is doing. So this is possibly the only race where I wouldn't recommend that particular mod. All right, and so then I mentioned that moving forward for the rest of the mods that I would recommend, I think you have two different options. I'm going to go ahead and talk about the non-Trajan option first of all. By not introducing a whole bunch of new units that will allow you to do things like change your technology tree in a way that impacts units. The technology mod that I recommend is the Khorne tech tree, which is made by Decky. This is again the same compilation. It's within the same compilation of mods that I recommended for the Kugath campaign. I really like these. It adds just a whole bunch of additional technologies, and since we're not going to be slowing down the research for Khorne, then if you're going to be playing a campaign that's a little bit more on the longer side, you'll have plenty of time to discover some of these new technologies. So I really like this mod for almost any legendary lord, but what it does do is it does provide bonuses for many of the units in the game, and if you start getting into a situation where you're starting to add more units, which would be the case if you use the Trajan mods, then unfortunately it's not going to affect those. So you're going to start to run into a balancing problem where things are a little bit out of sync. I don't believe it would crash your game, but I do believe that you would run into some problems where you would like to see the technologies affecting all of your units properly, and it just wouldn't do that if you did a mix and match between the non-Trajan mods and the Trajan mods. So your choice between the two alternatives is basically whether you prefer a rework to technology, or I shouldn't say a rework, I should say additional technologies or additional units. So for the additional units then, I'm going to recommend the Trajan mods, and I'm going to recommend the full Trajan's Khorne mods compilation because it just adds tons and tons of new units to the game. Obviously beautiful looking units. I'll go ahead and show some examples of what these units look like. And then I'm also going to show a little bit of the buildings where you can start to recruit these units in campaign. And as you can see, it just all of a sudden you're now looking at just tons of different units that are getting added to these different buildings. So anyway, it really adds a lot to the game. I wish there were some type of a compatibility addition where you could use both of the tech tree changes and the Khorne mods compilation by Trajan for all the additional units. But like I said, if you try to use both of them at the same time, it is unfortunately going to result in some kind of wacky things happening to your campaign. But anyway, like I said, I tried to keep this video quite a bit shorter than the Kugath one, partly because there's fewer mods to recommend, but also because I didn't want to spend nearly as much time. I think I spent way too much time on talking about the individual mods and the staples in particular in that previous video. So I'll go ahead and leave it there, but please let me know what your own experiences are. I do think Skarbrand is a really fun change of pace campaign. Excuse me, for me, and I know probably a lot of you have a lot more experience with Khorne and with Skarbrand than I do. So please let me know if there are others that you think can be added that do add value to a Skarbrand campaign. But to me, I played through Skarbrand here with both the Trajan collection and the non-Trajan, and both of them were an absolute blast. I'm going to mention one other thing, which is not a mod per se. Well, it's definitely not a mod, but it is a change to how probably most people play that I talked about in another video a couple of weeks ago, and that is I recommend turning up the Endgame crisis all the way to as early in the campaign as it can launch, and then just weakening the strength of the Endgame crisis, and it really adds an interesting element to your campaign when you do that. And Skarbrand is one where I think you can do that with minimal disruption to the campaign. It doesn't wreck your campaign. It doesn't even dramatically alter the way that a Skarbrand campaign plays out. But at least for me, in particular, the one where where the in-game crisis was the Sentinels of Nagash, it really added just quite an interesting new little wrinkle to a Skarbrand campaign. So something else to keep in mind along with all these other mods. So I think then with that, I will go ahead and leave it there. But like I said, I do welcome your feedback. Let me know what you think. Let me know if I have made any mistakes here. In other words, you're also letting other people know if I've made any mistakes, and then as well, let us all know if there are other mods that you think go along well with these or instead of some of these. So, all right. Anyway, thanks everybody so much for watching and listening, and I will see you all in the next video.